Blessed Lenten season, everybody, and Tony here with my review of Mozart's Idomeneo with conductor Alessandro De Marchi, which I saw at the Staatsoper den Linden. This marks the third time I saw David McVicker's production of Mozart's Idomeneo at the Staatsoper den Linden because I wanted to see, hear, and witness Rolando Villazón perform the role of Idomeneo. To say that I've had mixed feelings about Rolando Villazón is a mere understatement. I have been very conflicted with this particular tenor ever since his career came into full fruition, and nowadays seeing him sing all of the Mozart roles and Baroque roles kind of made me realize that he was trying to repair his voice after unwisely taking in heavier roles such as Don Carlo from Verdi's Don Carlo and Don José from Carmen, aside from the more lyrical tenor roles such as Nemorino from L'Elixir d'Amore and Edgardo from Lucia de Lammermoor. And if you've witnessed his disaster at the Met when he unfortunately cracked back in 2009, you already know. But we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about his performance of Idomeneo, which I thought he was able to be as charismatic as he's always been. After all, Rolando Villazón is still quite a charismatic and fine stage performer, and his voice still had sufficient passion and engagement, as well as that lyricism that made him quite renowned in his glorious prime. However, what he seems to do in order to compensate for whatever Achilles heels he's been having these days is trying to make up for the nasality as well as some woofy tones and some harsh guttural and unrefined singing with what I would like to call vocal and theatrical overacting. There were occasions where he was sobbing, there were occasions in which he was sighing and gasping, and there were also occasions in which he did make some rather unmusical choices, and there were also occasions that his notes tended to become quite screamy, and there were also certain occasions where his nasality has become all the more apparent. And that's kind of a shame because Rolando Villazón was one of the finest lyric tenors with a really good instrument, but he just didn't know how to control his technique properly, and the result was some pretty unattractive singing at his worst nights and some cracking along with it, and even the nasality and throatiness and some rather unrefined singing in general. I would have loved to have a lot more refinement, i.e. voices such as Nicolai Gedda, Richard Lewis, and Luciano Pavarotti, just to name a few of my personal favorite Idomeneos. But even though I did have some conflicting feelings about Rolando Villazón as Idomeneo, I could still give him credit for his charisma. I could still give him credit for his own virile charm, even though he kind of did waver on the nobility and manliness department. But at least he still had his charisma. At least he was still an involved stage animal, even though there were certain occasions where he did overact, and there were certain occasions where he was able to throw himself into the role, both vocally and theatrically. So while I am still very mixed about Rolando Villazón as Idomeneo, I still have to give him some credit where credit is due. He was still an engaging and charismatic singing actor, and even though his voice may not be to everybody's taste, at least he was able to try his best to act with it. Even with some moments of overacting, he was still engaging, he was still involving as well, but there were also occasions where he did kind of call too much attention to himself. But after all, he still had that unique charm and he still was pretty inviting as a singing actor. So I still have to give him his flowers. I still have to give him some salutes, even though some of them are quite hesitant. And I still think that he did a fine job overall, even with his vocal resources not being at their greatest prime, let alone being totally refined because of the consequences that he's unfortunately faced in terms of abusing his natural lyric tenor voice. Nevertheless, he still demonstrated charisma and confidence, which I can never fault him for. Friedrich Hamel was still as solid and strong as Nettuno, and even though his bass baritone voice may be an acquired taste, at least he still had sufficient vocal presence to make this character part his own, and owned it he did. Jonah Hoskins was absolutely fine and dashing as Arbace. His light lyric tenor voice is pleasing to the ear. It's quite balmy in terms of emission, and it may not be the biggest or the most exciting or the most thrilling voice I could ever hear. But what he was able to accomplish as Arbace was nobility, a dashing stage presence, as well as an equally handsome tone that was youthful, charming, and had a silvery edge to it. He was also able to tackle his high notes as well as his aria, C'est tout droit, with sufficient vocal beauty. Yes, it may not be as full as, let's say, Frank Little, who is my personal favorite tenor singing Arbace, or as steely as Herbert Hunt, but I can still give Jonah Hoskins loads of credit for his dashing stage presence and that pleasing light lyric tenor voice that does have the potential to keep on growing, developing, and flourishing in the right way, so long as he sings pharyngally as well as eliminate any sort of masky nasal singing, because this is a light lyric tenor who is definitely gonna go places so long as he develops his technique in the best possible way, sings in coperto, as well as eliminate any sort of masky nasal singing. There is a clear and clean voice right in there so long as he is able to develop properly, as well as ensure that he does not give in to any bad habits whatsoever. When all is said and done, I still have to give Jonah Hoskins a lot of kudos for such a dashingly fine job as Arbace, all thanks to that pleasing light lyric tenor voice and that fabulously fine stage presence. Florian Hoffmann continues to be as vocally charismatic as the High Priest of Neptune. While his nasality can still be an Achilles heel, at least his vocal presence and his stage presence were thoroughly handsome, strong, and imposing. Hanna Elisabeth Müller as Elektra was gorgeously sung with nobility as well as womanly elegance, and that's fine and dandy, but I would expect this type of trait to be found more in roles such as Elsa von Brabant, Eva Pogner, Elisabeth from Tannhäuser, Mimi from La Bohème, Liu from Turandot, Alice Ford from Falstaff, and Arabella. In fact, the full lyric soprano route has always been the direction that Miss Müller has been going through ever since she bade farewell to the light lyric soprano roles and thoroughly embraced the full lyric soprano repertoire with roles such as Arabella and Eva Pogner. So her Elektra was still gorgeously sung, but with some reservations. I'm still kind of missing that rage, that searing passion, and that searing anger in her voice that I've always loved in singers such as Edda Moza, who was totally unbeatable as Elektra. If I want slightly more agility as well as silver combined with steel, Joan Sutherland was definitely the dramatic coloratura soprano who could handle Elektra so beautifully, as well as Carol Neblett, who was the complete package when it came to agility, rage, fierceness, cruelty in that voice, and that sheer vocal abandon that has thoroughly defined Carol Neblett in a role such as Elektra. Heck, if I wanted more dramatic coloratura soprano agility, even though these exponents are more of lyric coloratura sopranos, you can't go wrong with Luciana Serra and Mariela de Villa, who were both former Ilia Elias, but have also tackled Elettra much later in their careers. The other thing I was kind of missing with Hanna Elisabeth Müller as Elettra was more coordinated chest tones, as well as chest tones to make Elettra's rage in Doreste Daiace and Tutto il cor mi sento absolutely palpable. That would have been absolutely brilliant to have heard Hanna Elisabeth Müller take advantage of her coordinated chest tones and chest tones with everything that she's got. And I seriously encourage Hanna Elisabeth Müller to take advantage of her chest tones, as well as coordinate head voice and chest voice, because that is where the real drama is. Who knows? Maybe if she continues to develop her coordinated chest tones as well as real chest tones, then I could definitely hear her one day as Elsa von Brabant from Lohengrin and Elisabeth from Tannhäuser, as well as more performances as Agathe from Der Freischütz and Alice Ford from Falstaff, and even Desdemona from Othello. Who knows? The possibilities for Hanna Elisabeth Müller are absolutely endless, so long as she continues to develop her chest tones. And it would have been awesome to have heard her sing the high C to wrap up Doreste Daiace. That would have been really epic. But if I take whatever issues I've had with Hanna Elisabeth Müller as Elettra out of the way, I could still argue that she was still a fine musician, a consummate singing actress, and someone who still embodied Elettra with regal elegance, as well as that sinuous seductiveness that specifically reminds us, the viewers and listeners, that Elettra is first and foremost a princess, not just some raving mad woman who gets so jealous and clingy. She is a princess first and foremost, and she is royalty, which Miss Müller did so well. Even though there were some vocal resources that were slightly missing from Hanna Elisabeth Müller, I could still give her some credit for what she was able to accomplish as Elettra, thus embodying her with elegance, style, and wonderful feminine manner. So brava to Hanna Elisabeth Müller for a job finally done as Elettra. I'm also in two minds about Emily D'Angelo as Idamante. I love her stage presence. I love how thoroughly dedicated she is as a singing actress who is able to make Idamante this dashing and charismatic young man who is also torn between the love of his father and the romantic love of his darling Ilia. But there are some reservations with Emily D'Angelo's voice. Yes, I do love how she was able to tackle the high notes. Yes, I do love that interesting timbre that she has in her mezzo-soprano voice, but when listening to Emily D'Angelo a lot more critically, sometimes I get the impression that she suffers the same issues that Marilyn Horne suffered from, as in a natural soprano who tries to pass herself as a mezzo, but doing so with very mixed, let alone not so pleasing results, i.e. throatiness and that type of voice that tended to be artificially darkened. It says a lot when singers such as Agnes Balza, Frederica von Stade, and Maria Ewing had natural darkness in their voices, as well as loads of agility, plus, most importantly, coordinated chest tones and natural chest tones. This is especially the case found in Agnes Balza, who I will always argue was the most unbeatable interpreter of Idamante of all time because of her sterling technical prowess. But I thoroughly digress because Emily D'Angelo was still a dashing singing actress with an interesting timbre to her voice, with loads of potential to keep on developing in the best possible way. But more than anything, it's her stage presence that made me thoroughly engaged with her performance as Idamante. So vocally, she was quite mixed in terms of the results that she delivered, but when it comes to her overall theatrical charm, she was able to sell it so well as Idamante, which I can never fault her for. Slavka Samitnikova definitely stole the show tonight as Ilia. That silvery, sweet, and sparkling light lyric color to her soprano voice was just thoroughly beautiful to listen to, like a cascade of pearls, jewels, and diamonds falling right out of her mouth. At times, her voice reminds me of a combination of Elena Kotrubash, Lucia Pop, and Valerie Masterson, as well as Annelisa Rothenberger, because of that silvery quality and that sheer gorgeousness that made her voice sparkle like the finest of diamonds. And while we're at it, there were times that she did remind me of a combination of Luciana Serra, Mariela de Villa, and even a bit of Yvonne Kenny when she was still a young singer. Sure, you could argue that she could use a lot more creaminess to her voice, especially done by singers such as Lisa de la Casa, Sena Yurnats, and Yvonne Kenny, who was my personal favorite singer for Ilia. But I thoroughly digress because Slavka Samechnikova was absolutely gorgeous from beginning to end. I could definitely see an amazing future for Miss Samechnikova in roles such as Lucia Ashton from Lucia de Lammermoor, Linda de Chamonix from Linda de Chamonix, Rosmonda d'Inghilterra from Rosmonda d'Inghilterra, Elvira from I Puritani, Alaide from La Straniera, Violetta Valerie from La Traviata, Medora from Il Corsaro, Giovanna d'Arco from Verdi's Giovanna d'Arco, Corinne from Il Viaggio a Rams, Magda di Civri from La Rondine, Anna from Le Villi, and Alzira from Verdi's Alzira. And if we're talking about French roles, Leila from Le Pêcheur de Perles, Antonia from Le Comte of Man, Mélisande from Péléas et Mélisande, Cendrillon from Massenet Cendrillon, and both La Solia and Nina from Massenet Cherubin, and I dare not forget about Manon Lescaut from Massenet's Manon. The possibilities for Slavka Samechnikova are absolutely endless because she definitely has a sterling technique that also needs a lot more growth in the best possible way, such as more coordinated chest tones and more chest tone usage so that her voice can fully blossom into wonderful maturity as well as a whole lot more clarity. Special kudos also has to go to Dionysios Avgerinos, Junho Huang, Sandra Laagus, and Serafina Starke as the two Trojan men and the two Cretan women respectively for their absolutely amazing vocal prowess, and the movement group consisting of Alberto Aymar, Michael Belilov, Miguel Angel Collado, Carl Antonio Janke, Akis Kalabokis, James Kingsford Smith, Shiping Lin, Yannick Neufer, Enrico Paglialunga, Filippo Serra, Andrea Sparta, Mikhail Stepanov, and Po Nyen Wang for their wonderful choreography and for their engaging stage presences that made me thoroughly enthralled with everything they had to offer. So while this singing did vary in quality, at least everybody managed to do such a fine job in terms of their overall collaboration and dedication as performers. While I do continue to have a lot of mixed feelings about Rolando Villazón as Idomeneo, he is still charismatic, he is still dedicated, and he is still an absolutely engaging singing actor despite some moments of overacting, whether it's vocally or theatrically. At least there were also some fine shining stars found in Hanna Elisabeth Muller as Elektra and Slavka Samechnikova as Ilia being the brightest star of them all. Jonah Hoskins still needs to find a way to let his voice thoroughly bloom and be more present, because that's definitely a voice, let alone an instrument, that has great potential to keep on growing the best possible way, as well as grow in a lot of conscientiousness. Friedrich Hammel and Florian Hofmann continue to be fine singing actors, and Emily D'Angelo must find a way to ensure that her voice gains in clarity, chestiness, and even great coordinated chest tones to ensure that her voice does not suffer from any type of fallacy whatsoever. At least I could also salute Dionysios Avgerinos, Junho Huang, Sandra Laagus, and Serafina Starke for their great performances and great vocal work as these minor characters of the Trojan men and the Cretan women respectively. All in all, a respectable effort from everybody, all thanks to their fine collaborative efforts as well as their dedication as performing artists. The conducting done by Alessandro De Marchi was brisk, nuanced, and thoroughly exciting. There was not one boring moment when he led up that orchestra and whipped up that orchestra into great shape. He was thoroughly engaged with the text and thoroughly engaged with the tension, drama, and action of Idomeneo, thus making sure that we, the audience, are thoroughly aware of what's going on, and he definitely led the orchestra so beautifully and so excitingly, and the chorus and the orchestra of the Staatsoper unter den Linden were thoroughly brilliant. Rolando Villazón may be a singer I have had way too many opinions about in terms of conflicting ones and in terms of certain feelings that kind of made me feel rather mixed about him as a performer, given his voice not being in great shape these days, as well as abusing his naturally fine full lyric tenor voice with a technique that became his ultimate Achilles heel. Nevertheless, I still have to give Senor Rolando Villazón a whole lot of credit for what he was able to accomplish as Idomeneo. His overall stage involvement, as well as his charismatic involvement and engagement with the character, made him a welcome treat, even for those who may not care too much about Rolando Villazón, as well as his fans who still stick by him. Even though his vocal resources were kind of wavering these days, especially given his history of taking on too many heavy roles that otherwise hampered his naturally handsome full lyric tenor voice, at least he was still an engaging singing actor, and he was still able to be thoroughly charismatic from beginning to end, even though there were times that he did kind of ham it up. But at least the other singers managed to do such fabulous jobs, with Hanna Elisabeth Muller and Slavka Samitnikova stealing the show as the two rivaling princesses, and Jonah Hoskins's future continues to look a lot brighter, as does Emily D'Angelo, so long as they thoroughly develop their techniques, and Friedrich Hammel and Florian Hofmann were still as solid as they've always been in their respective roles. And for those of you who caught this performance of Mozart's Idomeneo at the Staatsoper unter den Linden, what'd you think of it? Did you feel that Rolando Villazón was thoroughly fine as Idomeneo? Did you feel that he was okay at best? Did you also feel that his voice should have been a lot more refined or a lot more polished when singing his big aria, Fuor del Mar, or a lot of his arias in general? Or did you feel that Rolando Villazón was not really a great fit for Idomeneo? Please let me know in the comments below. Well, that's it for my review of Mozart's Idomeneo, starring Rolando Villazón as Idomeneo at the Staatsoper unter den Linden. Tune in next time for my review of Richard Strauss's Intermezzo at the Deutsche Oper Berlin. So until then, blessed Lenten season, everybody.